Everyone, today we are going to be reading our third chapter of The Explorer by Catherine Rundell. I hope you all enjoyed it yesterday and are ready for the next chapter. If you haven't read it already, go and answer the questions and watch the corrective videos. Okay, this one is called The Den. It was ferociously hot and he was still alive. Those were the first thoughts that came to Fred as he opened his eyes and found himself staring up at the Brazilian sun. Instinctively he looked down at his wristwatch, but the face was cracked and the minute hand had fallen off. The two girls were asleep next to him. Both of them were covered in blood and scabs, and they were breathing easily. Con had her thumb in her mouth. There was a host of dragonflies in luminous blues and reds dancing around them. He thought they might be attracted to the blood. There was no sign of the little boy. Max was missing. "Max," Fred whispered, jumping to his feet. There was no answer, no movement except the burr of dragonfly wings. Fred's heart started to pound. "Max!" he called louder. Lila stirred in her sleep. He ran to the edge of the trees. There was no trace of the boy. "Max!" he roared, staring wildly around. "What?" Max looked up. He was lying on his stomach behind some fern-like plants next to the vile-smelling puddle, splashing his fingers in the water. "Max!" Fred ran over to him, wincing as one of his ribs protested sharply. "You haven't been drinking that water, have you?" Max stared up at Fred as he approached, then screwed his eyes shut and let out a scream that shook the baby flesh in his cheeks. Across the clearing, Lila gave a yell as she startled awake. "That's not very flattering," said Fred to Max, but it was possible, he reckoned, that covered in blood and soot, and with less eyebrow than normal, he didn't look very reassuring. The boy kept screaming, barely drawing breath. Lila jumped to her feet. "Max," she called, "what's happened?" "Sugar," Fred thought. He knew that you should give people sugar for shock. "Do you want a sweet?" He had some mint humbugs in his pocket. "Please stop crying." He fished the sweets out. His hand came out wet. There was a cut on his thigh and half-dry blood soaked in his pocket, and the mints had spent the night marinating in it. He grimaced and put one in his mouth. The taste hadn't improved, but the sugar gave his blood a twitch. "Do you want one of these?" Fred spat on a corner of his shirt and polished one clean. "It's a mint." "No, I hate mints," said Max. "It's the only food I've got." "Oh, then I'll take it," said Max. He said it like a lord accepting a peasant's bread. "Off you go." "Here," said Fred. He put it in the boy's sticky hand. "Eat it slowly if you can." Max sucked loudly. His nose began to run, down past his lips and onto his chin. "Max!" Lila called. "Come here." "Come on," said Fred. The boy's face was intent on working on the mint, his eyebrows furrowed in concentration. He looked very breakable. Fred felt his chest tighten, but he said only, "You should probably blow your nose." "I don't blow my nose," said Max. They walked on, both limping towards Lila. "It's not a thing I do." "I think you should." "No." Max licked the snot off his upper lip and added it to a mouthful of mint. 5-year-olds were not easy to argue with, Fred thought. Max had a sweep of dirt encrusted on his cheek, and his eyebrows turned up at the corners. It gave his face a mischievous tilt. Fred hooked his finger onto Max's shirt collar to steer him from the thorns and what looked like rabbit droppings. The ground was mossy, speckled with patches of grass and creeper. One of the trees had scarlet flowers that had fallen and red carpeted the floor. Sitting among the flowers under the bright white sun, Lila and Con were arguing. "You, boy, what's your name? Fred," called Con. "Come and tell this girl that she's completely wrong." "She thinks," began Lila, flushing. "Obviously, I think that we should go back and wait near the plane," said Con, "in case they can see it from the air, so they can rescue us." "It makes more sense to stay here," said Con. She pulled her knees up to her chin. "We'll just get lost trying to find our way back, and I don't think anyone will see the plane. They don't know where we crashed. They'll have to search the entire jungle. We're on our own." She fixed her eyes on a dandelion-like plant, fierce and unblinking. "We'll have to find a way to get to Manaus ourselves." Fred looked at the girl properly. She had a scratch across one side of her narrow face, and her hair was woven into 2 dark plaits, one of which had been charred in the crash. She wore a scarlet skirt and a blood-red top, both now stained grey-green. She looked about his age. Con was scowling. She was scowling at Con. Con glared back. "That's crazy. We need to stay near the plane and wait to be rescued. My family will have sent a dozen planes to search for us now. 100 planes, probably." "But," said Lila, "where we crashed is burnt by fire. Half the trees are charcoal, so there's no animals." "We don't need animal friends," said Con. "This isn't a fairy tale." "For us to eat," finished Lila. "And back there, there's—" "What?" said Con. "There's the pilot." "He's dead," said Con. She seemed genuinely confused. "He can't hurt us." Lila spoke very quietly, but Fred was surprised by how authoritative she sounded. "We should make camp here." "No," said Con. "That's completely illogical." "Fred," asked Lila, "you get the deciding vote." "No, he doesn't," said Con. "That's not fair. One person shouldn't get to decide." "Not unless he agrees with me." Fred looked around the clearing again. The air was fresh here, and the sky above them a blue that doesn't exist in England. He was just about to answer when he saw at the far end, where the forest grew thick and tangled, 4 trees had fallen together, their tops meeting in a point. The very tips of the hairs on the back of Fred's neck began to rise. "Do you think there's anything odd about this clearing?" he said. "That's not an answer to the question," said Con. "Why?" asked Lila. "Those trees," he said, "over there," and pointed. "What about them? They fell over," said Con. "That's what trees do." "But they don't look like they fell to me," said Fred. He ran across the clearing. A sense was rising in him that something was strange. His curiosity pushed aside his fear. The largest of the trees was immense. Its trunk was as thick and tall as Nelson's column in Trafalgar Square. 3 smaller trees leant against the thicker one. Each had grown a few feet from the next in a rough square, their branches entwined and darkened by green creepers. "Leave it alone, Fred," called Con. "Stay in the open." "There's something odd here." He ran his hand down one of the smaller trees. At the base was a mess of fern-like plants and a few mushrooms. He pushed the ferns down and felt his stomach swoop. The 3 smaller trees didn't have roots. They were logs 15 feet high, each carefully tipped up against the central tree. He could see where they'd been hacked with an axe or a machete. Ferns had grown, or been planted, Fred thought, at their bases, disguising the places where the cuts had shown. "A den," breathed Fred. "What did you say?" called Con. Fred pushed at the vines that stretched between each of the logs. "It's like a tent," said Fred. "A den." He pushed down, ready to push past the foliage. "No, don't go in there," said Con. It came out in a burst. "It's not that I'm scared, but please don't. It's not a reasonable risk." Fred stared at her. "A what?" He had never in his life considered whether a risk was reasonable. It sounded like something the headmaster would say. "There could be anything in there. Jaguars or snakes or rats," said Con. "I can't not look," said Fred, astonished. "She might be right, though," said Lila. "About the snakes. Be careful." "I'll look," said Max, grandly jumping to his feet. "You absolutely won't," said Lila, grabbing his wrist. "You're staying right here." Fred pushed aside the vines hanging down between the logs. "Ugh!" he winced. Some of the tendrils had tiny but vicious thorns, and they caught in one of his cuts. He brushed away another handful of vines and froze. His heart, which hadn't stopped double beating since the crash, quickened to triple speed. The trees met to make a tent, high enough for a man to kneel in, or for someone Max's height to stand. The air smelt deep green. There was a spiderweb in one corner, and below it was a pile of banana leaves, stacked a dozen leaves thick in the shape of a sleeping mat. They had been almost entirely devoured by ants. Fred looked up and felt his eyes stretch wide. "Come and look at this," he called. The space between the 4 tree trunks had once been covered in a wreath of plaited palm trees. He reached up and touched them. The palms were riddled with holes, half rotted, and the light shone through, but he could see how intricately they'd been woven. He crawled further in, slowly, looking for snakes in the green light. The ground squelched under his hands. In the far corner of the den was a hollow gourd, rotted with mildew. Fred touched it gingerly. It was mulchy. He turned it upside down and wrinkled his nose at the smell. A cascade of flints spilt out. Half had been chipped into the shape of arrowheads, others were square and squat, large as a fist. "You two!" He crawled backwards and stuck his head through the vines. "Come in, quick, you have to see this, someone was here." "You're crazy," spat Con. "If someone was here, they wouldn't want us trespassing. I've had enough of this." She turned and began to march back into the trees. "Wait, Con, we shouldn't split up," called Fred. Infuriating, he scrambled out of the den and ran after her. "Whose house is it?" She turned to face him. Fred was startled and there were tears in her eyes. "You don't know, do you?" "Of course I don't," said Fred. "But I just think, what if they came back? I've read about it in..." Con hesitated, casting around for an idea. "Goldilocks. I know how that ends. I'm not getting eaten." "I'm pretty sure this place wasn't built by bears," said Fred. "It could be cannibals." "Cannibals are mostly a myth," said Lila. "Says who?" "Everyone. Our Mama and Papa." "How do they know?" "Mama grew up in the jungle near the Solimo's River, and she's a scientist, a botanist." "Botanist," said Max. Con scowled at him and the nerves in her face twitched. "You overrate the wit of the word bottom." Lila put a protective arm round Max and went on as if she hadn't been interrupted. "And a papa's English, and he studies the plants of the jungle for medicine. And our grandmother was a scientist assistant. We were supposed to be going to visit her in England. We were going to get the boat from Mineas. She wanted to meet us before she died. She wanted to see what Max was like." Con snorted. "Perhaps it's just as well we crashed." Lila ignored that. "Listen, whoever lives here, if they come back, they might be able to take us to Mineas." "Or they could eat us to dinner," said Con. She stared from Lila to Fred, angry and bewildered. "Just come inside," said Fred. "You'll see, no one's been here for ages." Grudgingly, very slowly, Con turned around. She bent down and edged into the shelter. Max and Lila followed. Fred pulled at the rotten leaves lining the roof. "We could weave new leaves to the ceiling," he said, "and make new beds. Then it would smell less like a sock." He began gathering armfuls of half-decomposed foliage and pushing it outside. Underneath, the earth was soft and dusty. It smelt of 1,000 warm days, layering one over the other. Lila brought in an armful of leaves, each as big as a pillowcase, and she began to lay them down for beds. "And we could hang some extra vines over the front of the den," said Fred, "so nothing could see in." Con crouched under the shelter with her arms crossed. "Who died and made you king?" she said. "Nobody." Fred turned, startled. If we're going to sleep here, we might as well keep it waterproof." "I'm not sleeping here," said Con. "Someone could come back here any second." "But they won't," said Fred. "Did you see those flints?" "Yes." "They're covered in moss," he said. "So they're dirty. Fine. How is that supposed to be reassuring?" said Con. "He means they're old," said Lila. "It's deserted." "But why do you want to risk it?" said Con. "What if they come back here and think we're intruders?" "Or what if they're never coming back and they've left behind this shelter?" said Lila. Her voice wasn't loud, but there was a toughness to it. "If someone was here, that means someone else thought it was a good place to rest. That means it's safe." "But you can't know for sure." "But we can't know anything for sure," said Fred. "Lila's right. As soon as we work out how to get out of here, we'll leave. But until then, it makes sense to stay in a place where other people have been." "Unless they eat us," said Con. "I'm staying here," said Max. "I want to live in the tree tent, and if you try and make me move, I'll do a wee on you." "No, you won't." Con backed away, smacking her head on a tree trunk. "He does do that sometimes," said Lila. which, for the moment at least, more or less settled it. So that was the end of chapter 3. Okay, so chapter 4 is another long one, and it's called The River. It took some time to find leaves wide and strong enough for the roof. The first batch Fred tried tore in his hands, and the second turned out to have something on them that made his skin turn red and itchy, but the third tree had fleshy leaves as long as his arm. He and Lila tore them into strips and then wove them into great squares, which they wedged in and out of the branches of the supporting trunks. Con sat on the grass outside the den, digging a hole in the ground with a twig. Fred crawled into the den and looked up. The sun no longer filtered through 1,000 ant holes. The light inside was green, and underwater sunken treasure colour. He felt an unexpected surge of triumph roar through him. "It's good," he called. "You can barely see the gaps." He heard Lila cheer. Fred backed out of the den and stood up too fast. Suddenly his head reeled, colours flashing in front of his eyes. His lungs tied a double knot. "Are you all right?" asked Lila. "Fine," he said, more brusquely than he'd intended. Since his pneumonia, he hated being asked if he was all right. He tried to smile. "Thanks," he added. Fred had been sent to Brazil to convalesce with a distant cousin. The cousin's idea of a good time involved more playing bridge in a dark drawing room than Fred had expected. But, his father had said, it was the only sensible option. "I can't be at home to look after you," he said. "The firm needs me." "I can look after myself," Fred wheezed. "That's not possible," his father said gruffly. He had worked longer and longer hours each year, ever since Fred could remember. Fred couldn't remember his mother's face, except when he fell asleep. He'd never seen his father dressed in anything other than a suit, and over time the suits seemed to have seeped into his father's skin. His voice practically wore a tie. "You're treating me like a baby," Fred had said. "Nonsense," his father replied. "Come on now, you're a sensible boy." Fred's boarding school report always contained the word sensible. An unobtrusive presence in the classroom. Sometimes, when they could clearly think of nothing else to say that distinguished him from his classmates, they just added, "increasingly tall." Fred knew he was none of these things, or rather, he was tall. No one would have argued about that. He grew out of his clothes so fast that his ankles were constantly cold. But he was not unobtrusive inside, and nor was he sensible. Inside, Fred was hunger and hope and wire. It was just that there'd never been a chance to prove it. His father had always insisted so unswervingly on clean shoes and unrebellious eyebrows. But Fred's mind was quick, with sharp edges. He wanted more from the world than it had yet given. Now he tried to grin at Lila. "I'm just dehydrated. We need to find something to drink," he said. "You can live for a long time without eating." "No, you absolutely can't," said Max indignantly. "But you can't live for long without water." "Do you think we can drink from the—" Lila hesitated, searching for words. "Tiny cesspool?" Fred looked at the puddle of water. "We could, but I don't think we'd live very long if we did. But we're near the water. We must be," he said. "It was on our left when we crashed," said Lila eagerly. "Which direction did we run?" "Well, the sun rises in the east, so facing this way, left is northeast," said Fred. "How does that help if we don't know which direction we ran?" snapped Con. She was pale and there were circles under her eyes, as if someone had dressed a paint-smeared thumb to her face. It doesn't much," admitted Fred, "but northeast of here was England." The thump in his chest slowed a little. Northeast led to his bedroom at home, his bookcase, his cricket bat propped up against the wall. It led to his father. Con squared her shoulders as if readying to fight. "Are we just going to guess then?" "I heard," Fred said, "that you can follow ants and they'll take you to water." "Ants?" said Con. "We're going to take directions from ants?" Lila stared hard at Con and then at the ground, combing the leaves with her eyes. "Do you have a different suggestion?" she said. Con sighed and bent to look under a log. The first set of ants was a disappointment. Max found a trail of tiny red ones and bent down to stroke at them. "Look, they're shining!" "Don't touch," said Lila, snatching him back. "Some ants out here are dangerous." These ones, said Con, taking a step back. I don't know, that's the problem. The dangerous ones are called bullet ants, but I don't know what they look like. Bullets, presumably, said Con. Not necessarily, said Lila. Dogfish don't look like dogs. I remember being very disappointed. These ones look just like ants. You're still not allowed to touch them, said Lila, so don't try. They walked at a safe distance, all four of them with their chins on their chests, along a snaking line of trees. The ants led them to a large pile of leaves. Oh, Fred nudged the leaves with a stick, just in case there was water underneath. He recoiled. The ants were swarming over the carcass of a bird. It looked like it had, once, been a vulture. Now, though, it was equal parts bones and smell. That's not exactly what I was hoping for. You could not, he thought, trust an ant's sense of priorities. What now, then? Said Con, crossing her arms. Let's try again, said Lila. Maybe those were the wrong type of ants. It was Lila who found the trail of larger ants, ants with heads as big as ball bearings. They followed the track deep into the woods, Lila leading, Fred watching her. She was small and moved on the edge of her muscles like an animal, a deer or a lemur, as if she heard things other people did not. I can't believe we're trusting ants, said Con. She brushed a cobweb out of her hair and ducked under a branch. Even in fairy stories, it's a wise owl or something. Nobody goes to ants for help. She looked defiantly at Fred as she said the words. And then a thorn caught on the skin above her eyebrow and she let out a yelp. I hate this place. Fred looked back and found, with a lurch to his stomach, that the clearing had entirely disappeared. Which way is the way back? He said. The green of the forest seemed to thrum around them. Left at that tree that was covered in mushrooms, and then right at the bush with the green thorns, said Con. She didn't look at him, didn't see the surprise on his face, which he immediately tried to hide. We should mark a path, he said, so we can find our way back. Fine, said Con, unless we want to ask the opinion of, I don't know, a passing maggot. Fred tried to grin. Well, maggots are much slower walkers than ants. They'd make terrible guides. She didn't smile back. Fred slipped to the back of the procession. Every 3 or 4 trees he broke a branch and struck a leaf on the hinge it made. Con shook her head. That's not going to be any good. You need something bigger. She tore one of the ruffles off her once white blouse and tied it to a tree. There. Fred turned to look at her, crouched in the dappled light. She moved stiffly, as if unaccustomed to using her own body, and her clothes seemed to sit on her like a bear trap. There are outfits that suggest of their own accord that the owner should sit still and smile nicely. Con had been dressed in one such outfit before the crash had coloured it brown and green and red. Good thing you've got ruffles to spare, he said, and grinned. Con turned on him, the kind of look that breaks noses. Shut up, cricket jumper. Fred took a step backwards. I only meant it's useful to have clothes with extra bits attached. Boys' clothes don't. Fine, whatever you say. You don't have to try and be nice to me, you know. What? Fred stared, bewildered. I just want to get out of this vile place and back to school. I don't mean to be rude, but I'm not really interested in making friends, especially not with little kids. Lila heard them. I'm not a little kid, she said quietly. I'm just small for my age. How old are you? Con turned to Fred. Fred told her. But that's hardly older than me, said Con. And me, said Lila. I thought you were much older. Fred shrugged. Just tall, he said. But that means there's no adults, or even nearly adults, just 4 children, in the Amazon jungle. That, said Fred, sounds entirely true. Unfortunately, said Lila. Unfortunately, echoed Max. He wandered off a few paces, blowing nose bubbles with his snot. Lila darted after him, grabbed him by the sleeve. Stay close, she said. Her eyes were bones and eyes and nerves. As they walked on, a smell came to Fred on the air, something sharp and fresh, something that smelt more blue than green. Is that the river? I think I can smell it, he said. Don't be ridiculous, said Con. You can't smell water. But then she broke off. Through the thickly ranged trees, Fred could see a flicker of something that moved. "Come on," called Con. "I found the river." They stood where the ground curved to meet the river. The river was stark bright blue. "Do you think there are caimans?" Lila asked. Despite the sun overhead, she shivered. In the long winter of Fred's illness, he'd read dozens of books about explorers venturing out into the wild, armed only with a pith helmet and a penknife. He had a shelf full, all dog-eared and food-stained, and they'd all dwelt at great length on caimans. He decided to be honest. "Probably," he said, "but I don't know how else we're going to get water." "What are caimans?" said Con. "Alligators, like crocodiles, but with larger snouts." "But they're smaller," said Lila. "Probably." "Probably? Oh, good," said Con. "The caiman's like the sunny side of the bank," said Lila, "and we're in the shade here, so we're probably fine." "Everything's a risk here," said Fred. "I'm going in." Every hair on his arm stood on edge as he scanned the bank. He pulled off his shirt, then put it back on again. It occurred to him that it needed washing as much as he did. He slipped down the bank, his feet squelching in the mud, and dived in head first. The river was a gift. It soothed the burns of his cuts and the aches on his feet. Fred trod water, then kicked downwards below the surface where it was colder, and sucked in a mouth of water. It had a tongue of mud to it, and a strand of seaweed wrapped itself around his tongue. But at that moment it was the most delicious thing he had ever drunk, better than hot chocolate at Christmas or fresh lemonade in summer. "Come in," he called. Lila plunged in after him, carrying Max on her shoulders. Con hesitated on the edge, her face stiff and anxious. "We didn't do swimming at school," she said. "Only ballroom dancing." She entered the water slowly and swam in a nervous doggy paddle, her chin high above the water. Fred rubbed his arms and legs, feeling his cuts sting as he scrubbed the dirt off of them, then kicked below the surface again. His eyes opened in the dark water. A shoal of miniature fish swam by, followed by a single larger one. He came up for air. "There's fish," he called. "Try to catch one," called Con. Fred plunged down again. The small fish darted away as he grabbed at them. The larger fish ignored him completely. There was something eerie in its shape, almost circular, like a swimming dinner plate. The fish turned. It bared its teeth at him. Fred sucked in a lungful of river water and shot, coughing, to the surface. "Piranhas!" he yelled. "Get out!" Fred was floating near him. Max was floating near him. Fred grabbed and struck out for the bank, fear pounding through his limbs. "What are piranhas?" Con asked. "Fish with teeth." Con screamed a word Fred hadn't expected her to know, then swallowed a mouthful of water and disappeared under the surface. Lila, wild-faced, grabbed Con by the shoulders. "Don't thrash," she said. She hooked one arm around Con's waist, kicking for the shore. "Just breathe." Fred and Max scrambled up the bank, Con and Lila just behind them. They lay panting on the hot earth. Con let out a groan and spat a mouthful of weeds. "Fish! Fish with teeth! Nothing is safe here. You can't even trust the fish not to eat you. What else? Pigeons with fangs? Monkeys with guns?" "I read," Fred gasped, "that they don't bite unless they're really hungry." "They mostly eat small things, you know." "Birds and frogs," said Lila. She wrung out her hair. It was completely covered in a dusting of red-brown river silt. It looked, Fred drew in a great breath as if his heart was beginning to slow, like it wasn't going to do anything. It was actually quite beautiful. Silver with a red belly. "Beautiful?" Con stared incredulously. "As long as we're not bleeding into the water, we won't attract them," said Lila. "I knew that, but I panicked. We're safe to swim here. I think they'll ignore us." You think? Con was red in the face, sharp-boned, ferocious. "They're fish with teeth. Piranhas! You can't psychoanalyse them." Lila looked at Con. Her face was inscrutable. "I think," she said, "that the plural of piranha is piranha, not piranhas." "Oh, good," said Con. "It's always nice to be grammatically correct when you're being eaten." They padded damply back to the clearing. Lila used her wet shirt to wipe the mud off Max's face as they went. Their bodies steamed in the sun as they dried. Coming back into the clearing felt surprisingly like coming home. A scarlet parrot alighted on a branch above Fred's head, called in surprise at the band of dripping children, and took off again. Fred found the sharpest of flints and hacked off the bottom of his grey school trousers, making them into rough-edged shorts. The left leg was longer than the right, but he decided that didn't matter. The cut on his leg had begun to scab nicely. He pulled off his cricket jumper and wrung it out. Something in Fred was beginning to glow. Under the sun and the cry of birds and the great expanse of vivid green around them, it was huge and dizzying. It felt like hope. Either that, he thought, or concussion. Super. So we've got through 4 chapters already, and you now have your questions to answer as well. So they are on the end of this video or in the parent mail clip. So get going with answering those, and I will see you all tomorrow for another chapter. Bye!